of constitution, what is constitutional governance, its historical developments, its features, constitutionalism, the basic structure. We went to an extent to discuss the thing. The today's topic at hand is constitutional concepts. So as I also yesterday also I briefed you about the topic that we will discuss all the terminology being used in the constitution, basically in the preamble of the constitution, like constitutionalism, sovereignty, socialism, welfare state, fraternity, and in number of principles which are being used in the constitution, preamble, and constitution as a whole. So we have with us today Dr. Parth Shar. He is political science professor in our own university. Many of you have studied from him. He has a very good knowledge and very political insight. So it will be a good discussion on this topic. With this, over to you, Parth sir. And you have any question, like I said yesterday, you have any questions, clarification, statement, you can put it in the chat box, or after 1.5 hours, in the last 30 minutes, we will have a Q&A session where we will pick your questions. So, Parth sir, over to you.
Well, thank you, Gautam, and thank you, Asutosh, for giving me this opportunity. And I must confess this fact that Society for Constitutional Law and Human Rights has been one of the most active societies in our law school, and I have actively participated in the society in the past also. So the task in hand is that I've been given precisely 11 topics on which I have to speak. Now, speaking like in political science, these topics, if I have to take, it may take almost a month to cover. But I'll just give you a brief overview of all these topics. Probably I'll give 10 minutes to each topic, and then probably we can take Q&A in the next half an hour, in the remaining half an hour. So basically, the first topic which was assigned to me was constitutionalism, right? Talking about constitutionalism, let me tell you that this concept, constitutionalism, if you talk in its essence, it means limited government. Okay. If you talk about constitutionalism as a political philosophy, it talks about limited government and rule of law, as opposed to arbitrary or authoritarian or totalitarian rule. Now, let me tell you that a country might have a written constitution, but still may not have constitutionalism. On the other hand, a country may have not a written constitution, but still may have the spirit of constitutionalism. To give you an example, for example, take the example of England. UK doesn't have a written constitution per se. A vast majority of its provisions are based on customs and conventions. Still, the country have constitutionalism. On the other hand, country like China, it does have a written constitution, but we can't say that it has in its essence the spirit of constitutionalism. Now, as I told you, that constitutionalism is all about limiting the power of the state or the government, because practically it's the government which is running the country, right? So if you talk about the features, how is the power of the state limited? So the power of the state is limited by a written constitution. So most of the countries which are having constitutionalism in spirit are having a written constitution, and this written constitutional delineates the powers of different organs of the government, and there is a system of checks and balances which are also there in the place. Then the second important aspect, or a second very important feature of constitutionalism, is a charter of fundamental rights, right? Now, most liberal democratic countries are having constitutionalism, right? And they do have a charter of fundamental rights. And what does this fundamental right do? If you take the example of India, what is the fundamental difference between fundamental rights and DPSPs, Directive Principles of State Policy? The fundamental difference is that fundamental rights are negative directions to the state. It is curtailing the power of the state. If you read the language of fundamental rights, you will find that all these things are curtailing the power of the state. Just take any example. I mean, the language of fundamental rights are, the language of fundamental right is that state shall not discriminate in matters of, public employment on the basis of religion, race, caste, etc., etc. So what you read any fundamental right, a vast majority of them are negative directions to the state. They are curtailing the power of the state, right? So these fundamental rights are basically an agency through which the power of a state is curtailed. And if your fundamental right is curtailed, then you can go to the Supreme Court under Article 32 of your Constitution, or High Court under Article 226 of your Constitution. So an independent judiciary again is a feature of a constitutionalism, right? So a written constitution, it may not be necessary always, but more or less most of the liberal democratic countries, they have written constitutions, then a charter of fundamental rights, an independent judiciary, separation of powers. This is again an important aspect of constitutionalism. The powers of the different organs are separated by the constitution itself, right? On the other hand, in the case of China, a vast majority of power is concentrated in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So again, we can't, that is the reason we can't say that China is having constitutionalism in its real spirit, right? Then the other aspect is federalism. Again, division of powers between center and state. Another important aspect of constitution. You see how is the power of each and every feature of constitutionalism, you will find that the state power is curtailed. It is circumscribed. Then rule of law. Again, an important aspect. The absence of arbitrariness. This is an important aspect for constitutionalism. So these all are things which are important. So just to quickly summarize, if somebody asks you what is actually constitutionalism, you can simply say that as a philosophy, it talks about limited government and rule of law as opposed to arbitrary, authoritarian or totalitarian rule. And these are the features of constitutionalism, which I've mentioned: written constitution, fundamental rights, independent judiciary, separation of powers, federalism, rule of law. All these are important features of, they are important features of constitutionalism. Okay. Now coming on to the next topic, which was given to me, was sovereignty. So let me tell you that when we talk about state, the most important aspect of any state is sovereignty. It is this sovereignty which distinguishes state from other associations. No other association actually claims sovereignty. If you talk about civil society, it's not sovereign. If you talk about any pressure group, any association, it is also not sovereign in that sense. So state is the only association which can claim itself to be sovereign. And it is this important aspect which distinguishes state from other associations. Okay. Now, what do you mean by sovereignty? Sovereignty simply means the supreme power of a state within a well-defined territory, right? So it is the supreme power of the state within a given territory, and it has internal as well as external dimensions. Internally speaking, no social group should be in a position to challenge the authority of the state. And externally speaking, state should be independent to conduct bilateral or multilateral relations with whichever country we want. For example, when we say that India is a sovereign state, it means that internally Indian state, practically reflected by the government, is not, it should not be challenged by any other social group. Its sovereignty cannot be questioned, right? It's supreme. It is having supreme power within the given state, given territory, right? And externally, we are also independent to have bilateral or multilateral relations with whichever country we want. For example, if we want to have bilateral relations with Pakistan, we are free to have so. If we want to have bilateral relations with United States of America, we can have so. So nobody can dictate terms and conditions, over us. Now, this is basically the practical concept of sovereignty. But when we translate sovereignty into reality or in practice or in day-to-day lives, sovereignty, cannot be absolute. It cannot be, universal. Sovereignty of a country is challenged many a times, practically speaking, both externally and internally. Right? For example, let me give you an example of how the sovereignty of a country is challenged. In 1991, most of you must be knowing that we adopted new economic policies, right? We became from a closed economy, we became an open economy. We opened our economy to the outside. Do you know why we actually opened our economy to the outside world in 1991? One of the biggest reason why we opened our economy to the outside world was that we took loans from IMF, right? And IMF, while giving loans to any country, always places certain conditionalities. These conditionalities are technically called as structural adjustment programs, SAP. It is called as structurally adjustment programs. And there are a lot of conditions within the structurally adjustment program. One of the conditions was that we have to reduce our fiscal deficit and we have to open our economy to the outside world. We have to, open our economy for foreign direct investment, right? So don't you think in this case, because of our poor economic condition, we were forced to borrow money from IMF, and this basically, resulted in reduction of our sovereignty, or at least for that sake, our sovereignty was compromised because of this move, right? So this is just one example of how a country's sovereignty is constantly being challenged by, what you call as the external dynamics. Similarly, internally also, the sovereignty of a state is constantly being challenged by many social groups, right? Laws are not just made by the state, but they are also shaped by the traditional social customs of a particular country. Many a times, a country's constitution and its provisions are saying something different, but actually at the ground in the villages of India, the things which are being followed are not in consonance to the things which are proclaimed in the constitution. So I mean, what I'm trying to emphasize is that practically speaking, sovereignty of a country is not absolute. It is always being challenged by different actors, both externally and internally. Many times our parliament have to pass laws keeping in view not the national interest, but rather they are forced to pass certain laws keeping in view the interest of big multinational companies, right? So ideally speaking, the parliament has to pass laws as per the aspirations of the people, right? But many a times this is not the case. It is because of the pressure exerted by these multinational companies, because of which we have to pass our laws. Don't you think in this case the sovereignty of a country gets compromised? Yes, it does. And this happens. Even with the so-called most powerful countries, it happens. Is that fine? Because these multinational companies, these international organizations are actually called as in international politics as sovereignty free collectives. They do not owe allegiance to do not owe allegiance always to the national interest of a country, right? So this is the case. The next thing, the next topic which was given to me was socialism. And when we talk about socialism, you know that socialism was the word socialism was added by the 42nd Amendment 1976, There are certain directive principles of state policy which have socialistic perspectives. Now, when we talk about socialism, then it is primarily an economic concept per se. But when we talk about socialism, uh, in the strict Marxian sense of the term, then every country have to perform three very important functions. I mean, it has to decide three very important questions: that what is to be produced, how it is to be produced, and how things which are produced, goods and services which are produced, how they are to be distributed, right? So there are these three questions, fundamental questions every economy has to answer. Okay, so as far as these three questions are concerned, in a liberal democratic country, these three questions are basically answered via the principle of demand and supply. For example, what is to be produced is decided purely by means of demand. For example, if in a country the demand for motorcycles is more when compared with bicycles, a country would be producing motorcycles, right? And how it is to be produced, whether capital intensive industries must be employed or labor intensive industries must be employed. On this question also, on this particular question also, in a liberal country, it is usually which is cheaper, which is more cost effective. This is the way how this particular question is. And on the issue of how the things which are being produced are to be distributed, on this question also, it all depends upon the purchasing power of a particular individual. For example, if a person needs a medicine but doesn't have the money to buy the medicine, still that particular person in a classic liberal country would not be able to purchase it, right? On the other hand, the same questions on what to produce, how to produce, and how things are to be distributed are decided by need-based principle in a socialist country. So in a socialist country, simply we can say that the means of production and distribution are owned by the state. It is assumed that the state will actually, it knows your interest well, and it is the need-based principle that applies in distribution and production of goods and services. Now, India, if you take a look at India, Indian socialism is actually not truly Marxian also, and it is also not truly liberal. India rather has adopted democratic socialism, right? Which basically means the prevalence of a mixed economy, the existence of both private and the public sector alongside. For example, if you take a look at telecom, so there is Bharti Airtel, but there is also BSNL, right? So we have opted for what you can call as a mixed economy. If you take a look at the directive principles of state policy, and especially if you talk about Article 39B and Article 39C, then these are basically these are the directive principles of state policy which are pointing towards what you can call as these are basically socialistic in character. For example, Article 39B says that the material resources of the country must be distributed in a manner so as to serve common good. Thus, it talks about equitable distribution of resources. If you talk about 39C, then again it says that the state shall take measures to prevent concentration of wealth, right? So minimizing income inequalities. This is again a socialistic principle, right? So India has opted for not a strict Marxian conception of socialism where everything would be, everything would be what you can call is owned by the state. The means of production and distribution are owned by the state. Rather, what we are seeing is a principle of democratic socialism. This talks about progressive reduction of income inequalities and utilizing state resources for the common good, right? So now this is about socialism. Uh, Now let's talk about the next concept which was given to me was democracy. Now you see, ideally, whenever I ask any of my students what they understand by democracy, so usually the responses which I get are similar. The students always give me the same definition which was given by Abraham Lincoln, that it is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So let me tell you that democracy in the broader sense basically is not just a form of government, it is rather a way of life. And in its narrower sense, it means definitely a form of government. So when you say that, when we talk about democracy, it's basically, as a form of government, it is basically a government by debate and discussion. I always believe that it is. So what happens in parliament? The MPs are basically debating. So things are heatedly debated, and then the opinion which are considered better are actually considered pivotal. Now here I will like to distinguish between the procedural aspects of democracy and the substantive aspects of democracy. Right now, what do you mean by the procedure? For a democracy to be there needs to be certain procedures which are to be followed. For example, we say that India is a democracy. In fact, we say that India is the largest democracy. Why do we say so? We say so because there is universal adult franchise here. One man, one vote, one value, right? India has got a strict, India was one of the first countries who extended right to vote to all people, including women, at one go, right? This is something very big and unique, right? So one man, one vote, one value is an important procedural aspect of democracy. Then the elections in India are held periodically. There is free and fair elections. This is an important procedural aspect of democracy. There's an independent election commission which oversees whether the elections are going in a free and fair manner or not. Then there is also an independent judiciary. Then there is existence of multiple political parties which freely compete for power. And the party is democratically elected. It takes over the power from the party which have lost in the election, and there is this peaceful transition of power, right? And this is, let me tell you, this is not a unique feature. If you take our South Asian neighbors, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the winning parties are very reluctant to relinquish power, right? There are a lot of, so this peaceful transfer of power is again a very, very important aspect of democracy, right? So then, so these are important procedural aspects of a democracy. So often these procedural aspects are considered very pivotal for the functioning of a democracy. But let me tell you that just by the mere existence of these procedural aspects, we cannot say that we are truly a democracy. We are not a democracy in the substantial sense of the term, right? These procedural aspects are important, but they alone are not important to be a democracy. For a democracy to exist, there needs to be there are requirements of other aspects as well. For example, there must be liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? These aspects, which are slogans of the French Revolution, these are again very, very important aspects of a democracy, right? Now, just to give you an example, just giving one man, one vote, one value doesn't ensure democracy. Can a common person think of becoming uh, MLA or the MP of this country, given the kind of money and muscle power is involved in the elections, given the kind of social hierarchies that we have in our nation? It's very difficult, right? So for a substantive democracy to be there, the people must be empowered. Rousseau once said that the people of England exercise, or they are actually exercising sovereignty for a very limited period of time when they are casting votes. The moment they cast their vote, they are enslaved for the next 5 years, right? Because they cannot hold their legislators accountable during this intervening 5 periods. So the accountability and the actually the when you can say that the accountability of the legislators towards the people must be ensured, and it has to be continuous throughout the 5 years. And this could only be there when there is liberty, equality, and fraternity in the true sense of the term. Democracy in different countries are being challenged by communalism, regionalism, patriarchal mindset, current casteism. These are all considered as challenges to democratic functioning of a country. Okay. Uh, the next topic which was given to me was republic, right? So republic simply means that the head of the state must be an elected head, right? So there are two kinds of democratic polities: monarchy and of course there is republic. In a monarchy, the head of the state is hereditary. He comes to office through succession. The classic example would be Britain. On the other hand, in India, the head of the state, that is the president, is elected. Although he is elected indirectly through an electoral college. You must be knowing that there's this procedure of establishing an electoral college, and all the elected MPs, MLAs actually vote for the president's election. So he is elected. So in a republic, the head of the state is an elected head, right? Uh, the next topic which was given to me was liberty. Uh, Now, this is a very contested concept. What do you actually understand by liberty? The Constitution of India talks about freedom of speech and expression. It talks about freedom of worship. Uh, so these are the forms of liberty which are enshrined in the preamble, and they are being given with it. If you talk about liberty, it entails three very important characteristics. First, First is the concept of, it talks about freedom from restraints, right? The first aspect is freedom from restraints. The second aspect which is associated with liberty is existence of choices to individuals. And the third aspect which is associated with liberty is existence of material choices to actuate your choice. I'll give you an example. Uh, when we are talking about freedom from restraints, when I say that I am free to choose my career, so basically you are not being restrained by the arbitrary will of the other person, or the state is not dictating you to choose a particular career. So in that sense, you are free. This is freedom from restraints, right? And there is an element of choice also in this, that you are free to choose a particular career uh, unless that choice of career is harming others. Okay, so there is clearly the establishment of freedom from restraints, and there is also an element of choice here, right? But then again, these two conditionalities are just not important for realizing your freedom. You still need material resources to actuate your choice. For example, if a person uh, wants to be a astronaut, or for that sake he or she wishes to be a singer, just merely existence of choice, and just nobody is stopped from doing so, is not enough that you will become a successful singer. This requires substantial amount of training. This requires substantial amount of leisure time, which is actually required. So this is basically the philosophy of the Marxist philosophers, that there must be sufficient economic wealth or sufficient economic uh, material at your disposal to actually actualize what you are actually thinking about. Okay. So if a person is a laborer, he has to, for sustaining his family, he has to support his father. So how can you expect that person to be becoming a successful singer? It would be very difficult, right? There must be existence of choices to actually equate, to actually realize whatever you are actually feeling. Now, in political science and in constitution, there are two very important aspects of liberty. One, the first aspect is uh, the issue of the distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty, right? So the negative liberty is freedom from restraints. You must not be forced by the state or the other people that to actuate or to realize whatever you are feeling for, right? On the other hand, positive liberty is that your freedom could be curtailed for benefiting others or for the common good, right? So in this choice, in this second case, in the case of positive liberty, your liberty is coming with the conditionality, and that conditionality is that freedom to choose what is worth choosing. For example, if some of you are living in Dehradun and you have a choice of coming to UPS via your private cars, the state in this sense can curtail your choice of coming via your private cars, because this will contribute to environmental pollution. And in this case, your choices could be curtailed, and you might be forced to come via common transport, maybe via bus. So again, positive liberals argue that freedom is not just freedom from restraint. It is basically freedom to choose what is actually worth choosing from. Uh, Another important distinction, which is important for me to make when we are talking about liberty, there are different dimensions of liberty. There is dimensions of civil and political liberty. For example, right to life, liberty, and property, as John Locke said. These are important aspects of civil and political liberty. Right to vote, right? These are considered as important civil and political liberties. And there are also socio-economic liberties. Now, most liberal countries they always talk about giving civil and political liberties, right? They do not talk much about economic liberties in that sense, right? They focus more on civil and political rights, right? You have the right to vote. You have multiple political parties which are freely contesting for power. These are all civil and political liberties. You can form your own freedom of association. So most of the liberties which are there in Article 19 of your constitutions are basically civil and political liberties. So most of the countries, liberal countries, talk about civil and political liberties. On the other hand, the socialist countries or the communist countries focus more upon giving socio-economic freedoms. They talk about socio-economic liberties. Have you ever wondered why are directive principles of state policy not enforceable by the court of law, and why are fundamental rights enforceable by the court of law? Have you ever wondered? Anybody can answer this question. Yes, Rajeshwar, go ahead. Why do you think, have you ever wondered, why is it so that the fundamental rights are enforceable by the court of law? On the other hand, directive principles are not. Yes, go ahead, Rajeshwar. You can type in the chat box or you can use a mic also if you want. The reason, are you answering? Anyways, the reason why, because realizing directive principles of state policy will require substantial amount of resources to be utilized, right? That's why we always talk about their progressive realization. For example, right work. Yes, that is the reason, Prachi. We have to basically, a state has to, utilize a substantial part. So that is the reason for realizing substantial amount of resources, for realizing, for making this enforceable. For example, if right to work has to be made enforceable. Now just imagine that the vast population of India, where there is a huge amount of unemployed people, if they, all of them have to be, giving jobs by the government, this will require a substantial amount of resources to be exhausted. And we are not in a position of exhausting those resources. So therefore, they are not made enforceable. But socialist countries say that without having these socio-economic rights, political and civil freedoms are granted are meaningless. Okay, can a person who is not in a position to earn his livelihood, he cannot earn his daily bread, can think of becoming the prime minister? Or for him, these political freedoms are meaningless without having substantial amount of social economic well-being, right? Thus, just a important distinction, that all liberal countries talk about granting civil and political liberties, but they do not talk much about socio-economic. On the other hand, socialist countries focus more on providing socio-economic rights, but not civil rights. In China, a vast majority of people are getting welfare functions of the state, but they are still not given the right to contest election or to join any political parties or to form any other political parties except Chinese Communist Party. So that is the case. Okay. The next topic which was given to me was equality. Uh, Now let me tell you that the concept of equality, as you know, that it's given there in the preamble, and from Article 14 to 18, the right to equality is given and enshrined. And there are two things which are mentioned, very important, which are mentioned in the Constitution, that the state shall not deny any person equality before law and equal protection of laws. Right? Now these two terms are actually, they look similar, but they are very different. When you talk about equality before law, it's a negative concept. It is derived from the Constitution of United Kingdom, and it means absence of any privilege enjoyed by any individual in the eyes of law. Which basically means, that if there are two people who are performing some act, a similar act, without any legal justification, then the law shall treat them equally. They both should be punished for that. Thus, this concept of equality before law confers juridic equality of all people. Now, this juridic equality of all people is enshrined in the it's enshrined in the philosophy of one man, one vote, one value. Okay, it's enshrined in the principle of one man, one vote, one value. Similarly, when you talk about equal protection of laws, then this concept is taken from Constitution of United States. It's a positive concept. It means equal applications of law among people who have placed under similar circumstances. It ensures equality among equals. It is primarily an Aristotelian concept. Aristotle is called as the father of political science. very important political philosopher. He said that the principle of equality can exist among equals. In fact, unequal treatment of people under unequal circumstances is inequality itself. And herein lies the concept of social justice, right? That state shall, while making laws, take into account all the natural inequalities that different people and different groups actually inherit. You cannot treat uh, unequal peoples equally. This is the problem, and herein lies the principle, and herein lies the justification of the principle of affirmative action or reservations, which is a heatedly debated concept among you people. But I'm not going into that. Herein, this philosophy of equal protection of laws, the philosophy of affirmative action actually, lies here. The justification of the policy of affirmative action lies here. Okay. So, any questions till now? Okay. The next concept, which which was given to me was the concept of welfare state. Now, when we talk about state, so there are different types of states. Most liberal countries have, there's a distinction which is made. One important aspect is, in a liberal state, most of the liberal democratic states are basically minimal states, right? And there is another another category which is called as a welfare state. Now, when you distinguish between a minimal state, by the way, minimal state is also called as a night watchman state or a police state. So, a minimal state is a state which performs minimal functions. It just performs the functions like maintenance of law and order. It just performs certain basic police functions which cannot be delegated to private individuals. On the other hand, as opposed to it, we have got what you call as a welfare state. In a welfare state, all the functions, all the developmental, state is involved in all sort of developmental functions. State is involved right from the time you are born until the time you are buried or you are burned. It is performing all sort of functions, right? It is involved in all sort of developmental activities. For example, why we say that India is a welfare state. The reason why we say that India is a welfare state, because state is involved in almost all activities that we and you are part of. It is involved in health. It is providing education. It is providing all sort of services. So liberal countries and neoliberal countries talk about minimal state. On the other hand, a welfare state is basically a state which is talking about it, and it is actually performing a lot of welfare functions. But what we are witnessing over a period of time is a move from a welfare state to a neoliberal. If we talk about India, since 1991, there is gradual rolling back of state from many of these sectors. In India also, barring the exception of atomic energy, state has withdrawn itself from a vast majority of sectors. Even railways, which were hitherto a sector which was specifically reserved for government, is now getting privatized. So what I'm trying to tell you is that we are moving from a model of a welfare state towards a neoliberal state, where clearly the state is withdrawing itself, although it is still not completely withdrawn, but definitely it has withdrawn itself from many of the welfare functions which was earlier being performed by the state. Say that when I teach my first and second year students, I always ask them, give me some examples of Indian state is a welfare state. So all these subsidies which are given by the India, by the government on health, education, all these are all aspects of, all these are important aspects of welfare functions with the Indian state actually performs. The directive principles of state policy establish India to be a welfare state as opposed to a police or a night watchman state. So directive principles of state policy talks about of establishing India as a welfare state. Okay. Uh, the next concept which was given to me was fraternity. Now, fraternity simply means a feeling of there's a question: is privatization of everything by the government is the function of a welfare state? No, that is not a function of a welfare state. A welfare state is simply a state which is involved in all sort of welfare activities, is actively participating in economic development of the country directly, right? Because whenever the private sector comes into picture, the ultimate purpose is not serving it. The ultimate purpose is somewhere down the line there is a profit element which is also involved. Can you imagine a private bank opening its branch in the remotest corner of India? Can, would would a private bank open its window in a remotest corner of India? Uh, Kriti, which country is a minimal state? Could you please give an example? Uh, Many countries are examples. For example, United States of America is fast moving towards it's a classic example of a neoliberal state where a state has withdrawn from a lot of welfareist activities. Okay. Rajeshwar, I will answer this question, but before that, I will just like to, complete all the topics. Then have a debate and discussion about equality and equity. Okay. So the next topic which was given to me was fraternity. Now, fraternity simply means basically the feel of brotherhood and sisterhood among different people, right? Of a country, a feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood among peoples of among the citizens of a country. It is considered to be a very important aspect of nation building, right? When India became independent in 1947, it also witnessed a lot of communal rights, right? And there were a lot of people who lost lives, and there were demands different. There were different states which were basically thinking of carving out of the Indian territory. So the challenges were enormous, and it was felt that this feeling of fraternity is considered very important for nationalism, right? So what is nationalism? Nationalism is basically a feeling of oneness. It is a feeling of fraternity among the people, irrespective of their caste, class, creed, religion, etc. So this is fraternity is an important aspect of what you call as nation building, right? Now, the challenges to fraternity are the challenges of democracies are also the challenges of fraternity. Okay. For example, if you take a look, Pragyan, I'll just answer all these questions in a quick after once I complete all whatever I've taught, right? All the topics, and then we can probably take all these things which you are asking. Okay. So when we are talking about fraternity, what are the challenges to the fraternity? The challenges to fraternity are like communalism is a challenge to fraternity. Casteism is a challenge to fraternity. Intense regionalism is a challenge to fraternity. So all those things which we have basically we discussed while discussing the challenges to democracy are also challenges to fraternity, right? Uh, Here I am reminded of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and he said that he's given a very good definition of what you can say of democracy, and he says that democracy is a form of associated living. Now, and he further argues, how can associated living be possible when there is such intense caste system which is prevalent in a country, right? When a person cannot think beyond his or her own caste, how can fraternity be there, right? How can there be a nation? And so therefore he said that India is not a nation. India is not a nation, rather it is a bundle of caste, right? A feeling of solidarity and fraternity and brotherhood is a key to nationhood. It's a key to democracy. But when there is so much of hatred against different communities, when there is so much of hatred towards different castes, how can there be a nation? So fraternity is considered an integral aspect of nationhood. Okay, it is considered a very, very important aspect of nationhood. Okay. Uh, the next thing which was given to me was secularism, right? So again, a very heatedly debated concept, secularism. If you talk about the political philosophy behind secularism, or the political philosophy, as a secularism is a political philosophy. So let me tell you that secularism as a political philosophy is opposed to all forms of religious domination. It challenges all form of religious domination. It challenges not only inter-religious domination, but also it challenges intra-religious domination. Now, this is a very important distinction. Many of the people, whenever we are talking about secularism as a concept, we just emphasized on inter-religious domination, but we forget to emphasize the intra-religious domination. Okay. That's fine. Am I audible, students? Am I audible? Okay, so just keep writing in between yes, so that I just have a view that am I audible or not. Okay, so whenever we are talking about the concept of secularism, secularism as a political philosophy is opposed to all forms of religious domination. It challenges not merely inter-religious domination, but also intra-religious domination. Okay, and let me tell you that uh, when we say secularism in India, that secularism in India is different from secularism in the West. In the West, there is a strict wall of separation between what you call as church and what you called as state. I'll just tell you, Amisha, don't worry. I'll tell you. I'll give you a specific example to illustrate my point. But first, let me tell you what is the difference between the Western model of secularism and the Indian model of secularism. Now, when we talk about the Western model of secularism, the Western model of secularism emphasized on a strict wall of separation between what you call as church and what you call as state. There is this strict wall separation thesis that works, that the domain of the state would be distinct and the domain of the of the state would be different, and the domain of the religion would be different. Throughout the medieval times in Europe, there was this clash between church and the state. That who is sovereign, who is supreme, whether the church is supreme and whether the state is supreme. The sovereignty of the state was divided between church and between state. And because of this, there was a lot of conflict throughout the medieval times. If you talk about medieval Europe, if you take the amount of bloodshed that has happened because of religion has been immense, right? All these wars, whether this is 30 years wars, 100 years wars, all was fought because of religion. And it is because of that reason Marx have to proclaim the fact that he said that religion is nothing but the opium for the masses, right? Right? So because of these religious wars that happened in England and in entire Europe, it was felt in the Western countries that there must be a strict wall of separation between a church and the state. And what does this mean basically? What does this mean? This means that state will not aid. What does this strict wall of separation actually results into? That the state shall not aid any religious institution. It cannot give any financial aid to any educational institution run by religious communities, nor can the state hinder the activities of the religious community. For example, if a religious community is excommunicating its dissenters, the state cannot do much. If a particular religious community is not allowing a certain section of people to enter into the temple premises or the church premises, it cannot do anything, right? The state refrains from intervening in religious matters, or state is not actually supporting religious reforms. State-sponsored religious reform is not possible in the Western model of secularism. As opposed to this Western model of secularism, we have an Indian model of secularism. The Indian model of secularism says, it simply entails that there is no strict wall of separation. There is no strict wall of separation between religion and the state. In fact, state has intervened in religious matters in order to fight intra-religious domination and inter-religious domination. There are many instances where state in India has intervened to reform the religion. For example, abolition of child marriage, lifting the taboo on intercaste marriages, giving inheritance right to Hindu women. Recently, triple talaq was banned. It was considered unconstitutional. These are all examples of state intervening in the religious matters of different faiths. Now, coming on to the question which Amisha asked, what is intra-religious domination? Now, when you say the recent judgment or the recently, triple talaq was declared unconstitutional and, it was considered, it was banned by the, so this is an example of intra-religious domination, right? Wherein males are more powerful in religious matters. They can give talaq to their respective wives based on their own whims and fancies. This is a classic example of intra-religious domination. Inheritance was limited to Hindu males in the Hindu religions. Again, a classic of, again an example of intra-religious domination. So whenever you are talking about secularism, do not just confine secularism to inter-religious equality. It's not just peaceful coexistence of different religions and state simply treating all religions alike. It is beyond that, right? It is beyond that, and it is all about reforming or the interventionist approach of religion. So secularism in India is not just about principled equality among different religions. State does not have its own religion. It is also reforming the intra-religious domination. It is also about reforming or interventionist approach as far as uh, the religion is concerned. Okay, so this aspect I wanted to highlight, which is, that as a, that secularism is considered to be the, it is part and parcel of the basic structure. In the case SR Bomai versus Union of India, secularism was declared as part and parcel of the basic structure doctrine, right? So this is the kind of importance which we have given to secularism. 42nd Amendment 1976, the word secular was added to the preamble. You must be knowing all this. So I will not be dwelling more into it. I'll be focusing more on the philosophical aspects of secularism, which I have discussed. Uh, Now let's talk about, I think there's just one more topic which is left, which is justice. So justice is, although I mean, to summarize justice in one line would be very, very difficult. But justice is, in the simplest of the term, is giving each person his or her own due, right? It's about equal treatment of equals, and it is about extending proportionate equality, right? There are various dimensions of justice. There is a legal dimension to justice. There's a political dimension to justice as well, and there's also a social dimension to justice. When we talk about the legal dimension of justice, it basically emphasizes that uh, law is the declared will of the state. Law emanates from the state, and finally it emanates from the will of the people. It has to be issued by a definite authority. If violated, it is accompanied by punishment. These are legal dimensions of the justice. Talking about the political dimension of justice, which is also emanating from the legal dimension of justice, it includes establishment of a democratic order without discrimination. The Constitution of India does that. It provides equality of opportunity for all the people. So it establishes a democratic order without discrimination. And there is a social dimension of justice as well. This is which is more popular and which is more controversial also, the social justice. So the social dimension of justice, or the social justice, emphasizes on abolition of all kinds of discrimination and privileges that are there. It says and it emphasizes that the rewards must be given as per the merit and not as per birth, right? The merits and the resources of the society must be distributed, keeping in view all these prevalent discriminations, all these privileges which we inherit. You know, as a person, we inherit a lot of privileges, and there are people who are inheriting a lot of you know uh, discriminations. We inherit a lot of discrimination. You are born handicapped. This is basically a discrimination, right? This is basically a privilege which you doesn't have. This is a kind of a discrimination which you have naturally inherited. Similarly, if you are born in Ambani's family, you are a privileged lot, right? You have a privilege which you have inherited. On the other hand, a cobbler's son is having a, I will say what you said, is not a privileged person, right? So there are a lot of social and natural privileges. You are born in a dominant caste. This is a privilege which you have inherited. Your caste is your power in a caste-led society like India. So social justice emphasizes in creating a level playing field for everybody so as to realize your respective capabilities. Is that fine? It's basically talking about the ability to realize your respective capabilities. Okay. Uh, I think I have covered all the topics. Gautam, have I left any other topic which has to be dealt also? I think I just covered all of it. Any topic which is left?
I think, Pastor, you have completed everything. Ashutosh here. So
Okay.
be comprehensive and summarize way of telling them about all the basic concepts which were used in the constitution. So these terms are very, very important simply because of the reason that you will keep on hearing all these terms throughout the constitution. Till the time you are
Yes.
not clear with all these terms, then I think you will be facing a lot of problem in understanding the whole concept of the Indian constitution. So there are many questions, but again, I'm asking all of you that if you have any doubt regarding any of these basic concepts, any of these words which Pastor have discussed, then you can again ask. Patrali, you can take the question.
Sure, sir. So, sir, first we have a Rajeshwar. He was asking the difference between equality and equity.
Okay.
Parth, sir?
Okay. I heard that. Now, in order to understand the difference between equality and equity, it's important to understand the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, right? So, equality of opportunity is referring to equality what you've asked, and equity actually refers to equality of outcome. Okay. I'll give you a simple example to illustrate my point. Uh, when we are talking about equality, equality of opportunity, the Constitution of India provides India every citizen equality of opportunity. It is not. It is giving freedom from restraints. Now, but just merely giving equality of opportunity is not sufficient, right? Because the society itself is unequal. All of us are having a lot of, are inheriting a lot of privileges, and many of us are not that privileged. So in order to provide a level playing field to all, right, it's important to have equality of outcome. So whatever procedural equality or whatever procedure you are following, the outcome of that procedure must be just. So equity has the goal of providing everyone with the full range of opportunities and benefits, right? Is that fine? Rajeshwar, basically you need to understand that what is the principle behind why Indian Constitution has given reservations to a particular section of people. It is because that many of them have inherited, they don't have the kind of cultural capital at their disposals. They are not having, they have been historically discriminated because of a particular caste, and it is for this reason they are given certain reservations. So this is basically is what is actually equality of outcome. The outcome has to be just. Whatever procedures you are giving is immaterial, but it is the outcome that has to be just. So that is the fundamental difference. It's about availing those opportunities, right?
So, sir, the next couple of question is on ST. So the first question comes from Pragnya Patnaik. He asked, when India proposes ideas of vocal for local, there is a chance that the foreign markets exit the Indian market. In this case, isn't the function of welfare state improving the economy compromised?
Uh, Let me read the question first. Where it is. When India proposes the ideas of vocal for local, there is a chance that the foreign markets exit the Indian market. In this case, isn't the function of welfare state improving the economy compromised? Uh, uh, Pragnya, can you explain the questions? The question is not very clear. I mean, the question, can you just ask the question verbally so that it is more clear? Can you reframe your question so that it becomes more clear? I'm not getting the question. Uh, Next, Okay, we can take the next question, and then we can probably, if she comes back, then we can again answer that question.
So the next question is again on welfare state by Abhishek Kumar Srivastav.
Okay.
So he is writing, we already have the premium class trains like Rajdhani, Shatabdi, etc. And the fares of these trains is high. But by privatization of railways, the private players mainly focuses on amenities or facilities due to this fare increases. But the major section of the people are not able to afford the cost of the premium trains and the government operations of other trains or local trains. Then, in this case, how the current government achieves the goal of a welfare state?
Uh, in this case, of course, if you have to ask personally me this question, that privatization of railways goes against the concept of welfare. Yes, of course, because the question comes, welfare for whom? Is it just welfare for the 10% of the people who are supra rich and who are having deep pockets? Or is it about, giving a vast majority of people the right to travel at affordable cost? So, I mean, to me, definitely this is a move away from the welfare state towards a new liberal state, where you are catering to just a handful of people and ignoring the vast majority of the people which cannot afford railways. So this is definitely a move towards a neoliberal state rather than a welfare state. This is a move against the welfare function of the state, right? Next question.
So, Sir Pragya has repeated his question. He asked, what I meant was when the local markets are supported, the foreign markets are somewhere suppressed, which in turns may hamper the welfare of the state with regards to the economy. So, how is the welfare not compromised here?
When we are talking about welfare state, we are referring to welfare of a country, of a particular country. International politics, happens at the level of nation states, right? So first we have to ensure the welfare of the people of India, right, rather than the welfare of the entire world, right? So what I believe is, the welfare. What about our nascent industries? If we are not supporting our nascent industries which are in a very nascent phase, then, and we are just throwing them open to the outside world, then they are not going to, they are going to get perished. And most of the countries which today argue for free trade have themselves, gone for private. They have themselves supported their industries. They have followed isolationist policies. Countries like United States of America and many of the European countries, which today are talking about free trade and every market has to be opened, they themselves have followed isolationist policies in the past. What about their carpet industry? The carpet industry in India was very much, very, very powerful, but they didn't allow our carpet industries or our export of carpets freely operate there. So they themselves have followed isolationist policies. So we have to take into account the national interest of our country first, rather than thinking about the welfare of the entire global economy. Okay.
So, the next, it's rather a request from Rajeshwar and Bhavya to repeat the concepts of justice and liberty.
Okay. So, as far as justice is concerned, justice is all about giving each person his or her due. Okay. In the realm of political science, justice, or in the realm of constitution, justice basically means that what principles must be adopted to distribute goods and services in a particular country. How are the how are the what principle should be adopted for the distribution of goods and services, right? As I told you, there are three important components of justice. One very important component of justice is social justice, right? Which talks about abolition of all kinds of discriminations and privileges, and all the rewards must be distributed as per merit, not because of person's nexus to the given political establishment or by birth. So it is truly creating a meritorious society, meritocratic society in that sense. As far as liberty is concerned, I discussed liberty under various aspects. So I talked about negative liberty and positive liberty. Negative liberty focuses just on uh, freedom from restraints. It doesn't talk about uh, whether these restraints are helping in achieving the common good or not. On the other hand, positive liberals talk about imposing reasonable restrictions on the liberty of the individuals for the fulfillment of the common good. Then again, uh, liberty has again various dimensions. I mentioned that in most liberal countries, it is the civil and the political dimensions of liberty which are valued more. You know, you all enjoy civil and political liberty. You have the right to vote. You have to right to life, liberty, and property. These all things are important. But for socialist countries, there must be socio-economic liberties which are also important. So without having socio-economic liberties, you can't really enjoy political liberties. For example, a farmer cannot think of participating in the political process because he's busy in uh, earning his own livelihood. For enjoying civil and political liberties, you must have socio-economic liberties. Okay, I think I've made my point clear.
Okay,
Next
Partha, can
question.
I intervene a little bit?
Yes.
Partha,
Sure,
Ashutosh
sure,
here.
sure.
Okay, I
Go
just
ahead,
about
Ash.
the just I just about little bit about the concept of justice. So the whole
Yes.
concept of justice is very, very difficult technically, because if you want to go
Yes.
into practicality, there's a very
Yes.
classic example given by Amartya Sen in his book Idea of
Yes. Yes.
Justice.
Yes.
So
Yes.
where
Yes. Yes.
there are three child and there's one flute.
Yes.
There are
Yes.
three
Yes.
child
Yes.
and one flute. And
Yes.
both are claiming, all the three are claiming this flute. One child is saying that I have bought it, so it should belong to me. The other child is saying that I don't have any other thing to play, so I need this flute because I want to have something, because I don't have anything, because I am very, very poor. And then there's a third child who is saying that among all the three, I am the only person who can play it, so I can make the perfect use of this. So this is the reason why the whole concept of justice is very, very difficult. But if you want to get into the philosophical concept, kindly read, there's a book, John Rawls' Theory of Justice and Amartya Sen, Idea of Justice. These are the two classic books on the whole concept of
Yes.
justice. And of course, Michael Sandel's book on the justice.
Yes.
Michael
Yes.
Sandel's
Yes.
lecture.
Very interesting observation by Asutosh. If I have to cover justice, it would have taken me more than a week. When I teach my political theory student, you may ask,
Yes.
it takes me almost 3 to 4 lectures to cover justice. So there is the Rawlsian conception of justice. He is basically a liberal theorist. He talks about a liberal theory of justice. Then Amartya Sen, he's talking about capability approach. He has developed a capability approach of justice. Then, of course, there is Robert Nozick, who is again a neoliberal. He is given a neoliberal theory of justice. Then there are feminist account of justice. So feminists view justice very differently from these mainstream approaches. So again, most of the concepts, which I have, dealt, liberty, equality, justice, they are very contested concepts. From which vantage point you are looking at a particular concept becomes very important, right? So there is no one agreeable definition of justice, and there are various dimensions of it. So since it was very difficult for me to summarize the entire concept, and as you mentioned that you can use that book. By the way, as far as Michael Sandel is concerned, there are a lot of videos which are also available on YouTube. You
Yes.
can watch that on justice, and there's a course on EDX also on justice.
Yes.
This is very helpful for you for getting an understanding of justice. Uh, you can watch that. Any other questions?
Right, sir. Yes, sir. So, sir, the next question is from Raghav. He asked, somewhere we have seen that some basic principles like rule of law or separation of power are common in democracy and constitutionalism. So, what is the major difference between the both, other than that democracy is a form of government?
Okay. So Raghav, let me tell you that uh, what constitutes democracy itself is problematic. I mean, when we are saying democracy, even China claims itself to be people's democracy. It says that we are people's democracy. So what constitutes democracy? I told you that is the reason why I told you the procedural and the substantive aspects of democracy. Simply, democracy is not just a form of government. Rather, it is basically a way of life. It is about resolving your disputes without using violence, right? This is an aspect of democracy. And yes, there are many things which are common between constitutionalism and democracy. But these two things can't be compared. You can't compare an apple with an orange, right? And there are certain commonalities definitely between them. So democracy and constitutionalism are two very, very distinct categories, right? They can't be just compared, what I feel, right? Constitutionalism can be said to be a very important prerequisite for a democracy, right? So without constitutionalism, democracy cannot exist. For example, if you don't have fundamental rights, right, can there be a democracy? Because ultimately in a democracy, it is the people who are the most powerful. They are the real sovereigns. So without fundamental rights, which is an aspect of constitutionalism, there can't be a democracy, right? Separation of powers is again an important aspect of constitutionalism, and without that, so all these constitutionalism is in its essence contributes to democracy. Okay, democracy is a wider term, and constitutionalism is an aspect of it. But these are two very distinct concepts. Very difficult to distinguish the two.
So I hope that answers Raghav's question. So the next question is, from Neha, she asked, if one political party uses religion as its basic propaganda, is it not opposed to the idea of secularism, and is kind of unjust? So can judiciary consider it as violation of democracy or preamble?
Yes, of course. In this case, if one political party is using religion as its basic propaganda, uh, the point will come. Judiciary will intervene when that particular political party is formulating laws which are antithetical to the spirit of secularism, right? If one political party is passing laws and it is formulating policies which are antithetical to the spirit of uh, secularism, that of course judiciary can intervene, and judiciary in fact has intervened in many a times.
So the next question, she's asking, secularism and right to religion are contradicting each other. So she
How
would
can
like
you
to
say
know
that they are contradicting? They are not contradicting each other. Uh, in Indian model of secularism, there is no strict, as I told you, that there is no strict wall of separation between what you call as religion and what you call as state. So in India, state gives you the right to profess one's religion, right? And if that particular religion is having intra-religious domination, then the state can also intervene. So our model of secularism is very different from the Western model of secularism, and with that's why these two concepts don't contradict each other. I don't see a contradiction.
I
Next.
hope that answers. Uh, Abhishek Kumar Srivastav has a comment. He says, I think justice is supreme and it cannot be achieved. If court punishes the accused person, then for the victim justice is achieved. But if the accused person only the only breadwinner of his family, then it is injustice on part of the accused family. So he is commenting on the concept of justice. Um, any further questions do we have from the participants? Okay, so Bhavya asks whether the preamble is sufficient in itself or some other elements can be added to it.
I can't answer that question. I mean, yeah, the entire constitution is an organic document. It keeps on, adding more uh, important issues wherever it arises. So it's an organic document. Yes, of course, there could be certain elements which could be added with the need of the hour, depending upon the need of the hour. Yes, of course, they can be added, and they have been added in the past. And certain elements can also possible.
So I have a question to that. Can certain elements be dropped from the basic structure, like from the basic structure doctrine?
I mean, depends. I mean, it's a very subjective question. I mean, certain basic structures which you think are not relevant, or I mean, can be dropped. I mean, but then could be anything. I
I, I mean, I just,
mean, yes.
it's in my opinion, I have a question. Like, doesn't the basic structure doctrine goes against the idea of constitutionalism? So, constitutionalism basically talks about limitation of the government,
The
right?
power of the state,
The,
they are
the
limited to the power of the state. Yes, yes, yes.
yes, and also in India, see, so if after a certain point of time, let's say we reach a state where we can afford to be a capitalist state, but our basic doctrine says that socialism is the basic element of in the ideology of India. So we won't be able to change that, right?
So the
So
point is, constitutionalism aims at minimizing the power of the state, but the basic structure doctrine actually empowers the judiciary, right? It is basically empowering the judiciary, thereby it is basically contributing to constitutionalism. It is strengthening constitutionalism, right?
but doesn't it goes against the democracy?
Uh, I mean,
Okay, can I?
so,
Yes.
Ashutosh, yes, go ahead.
Okay, basically what Patali, you are asking about the doctrine of basic structure. So it's a concept. Basically, it's a concept, and we still don't know what is exactly its definition. And with
Yes,
the
yes.
change in the time, with the passage of the time, maybe certain concept is going to see a change. There's no doubt of it. For example, many people think that 50% reservation is a part of the basic structure because it was said by the nine court judge in the Indra Sahni judgment. But at the same time, right now, if you see the minimum reservation is 60%. So now the Supreme Court is going to hear this case. There are a number of cases filed in the Supreme Court that whether 50% rule was a basic structure or not. And now the Supreme Court will answer. Because maybe what is relevant in 1990 may not be relevant in 2020. So the basic structure is not a very stringent thing. It will keep on evolving with the society itself, just like any other concept. It will keep on evolving. It's not a straight jacket formula, and that is the beauty. Basically, we criticize the basic structure doctrine that it is not defined. But at the same time, that is the beauty of this concept is that it can keep on evolving with the passage of the time.
Okay, so so there are more questions. So the next question
Okay.
is from Yes, sir. So the next question is
Yes.
from Prachi. Asks about the negatives of constitutionalism.
So, I mean, all those characteristics which are strengthening the power of state at the cost of people are all antithesis of constitution. For example, if tomorrow, rather than separation of powers, the government passes any amendment and it basically concentrates the power of different organs into one body, this would be an antithesis of constitutionalism. If tomorrow fundamental rights are removed, this would be an antithesis of constitutionalism. A very, very powerful center is again an antithesis of constitutionalism. So all those provisions with power empower the state at the cost of people are basically antithesis to constitutionalism. They are negatives of constitutionalism. It criticizes the very spirit. It is against the very spirit of constitutionalism.
So the last question is from Abhi asking, we don't have a definition of a basic structure, then how can we remove something from that?
But there
That
are
is the
at times, many a times, the Supreme Court has said that, for example, parliamentary democracy has been defined as the basic structure. Secularism has been defined as the basic structure. So Supreme Court have defined many elements of the basic structure in many of the cases. So, I mean, it can be removed in that sense. I mean, I hope I make sense, Ashutosh.
Yes, yes. Because at the end of the day, there are in number of cases, for example, secularism is a part of the basic structure. Independence of judiciary is a part of the basic structure. There's something which is already being told that these are the basic structures.
They
If
can
you
be
remember
dropped.
the Yes, yes. If you remember the Anzac judgment, of course,
Yes, yes.
I'm not saying that we can remove. What we can do is that we can refine it. The concept can also be refined. Maybe independence of judiciary right now means that there should be no interference from the side of the executive. But maybe after 15 years, the Supreme Court will say that, okay, we want independence of judiciary, but at the same time, the executive can have a little bit of interference. So the concept will itself evolve. So independence of
Yes,
judiciary right now means no
yes,
interference from the executive.
yes,
But maybe after 10 years, we will see certain changes in it.
yes, yes, yes.
So I guess we do not have any more questions from the participants. So Ashutosh, sir, would you like to make a concluding comment?
Okay. So thanks a lot, Parth sir, for your lectures because it is highly, highly beneficial for all those people who are attending it. But as again, I will keep on telling you that Constitution is one of the subjects which cannot be, any concept cannot be covered in any of one of the lecture. So the beauty of this subject is every time you read a concept, you will understand it from a different version. So keep on reading because the same thing which now you understand in a different manner will be different when you read it from different perspective. So constitution is a will keep on evolving. So all these concepts which are there under the Indian Constitution, especially in the preamble, that are the basic thing which every law student must be knowing. Because generally what happens, especially when I also start teaching in my class, so many people are don't aware about these concepts because they don't have any art background. But if you don't understand all these basic concepts, then it is very, very difficult to understand the whole constitution. So my advice to all of you is that do read this Granville Austin book. Yesterday I also told you, The Making of the Indian Constitution. It's a book by the Granville Austin. So if you read, so he also tells you that how all these concepts have been taken and how it is being suited to Indian society or not. So kindly buy this book and read this book because I think this is a must book if you want to understand the
So
basic
very
of
good,
the Indian.
very good. Yes, yes.
Okay, that's all from my side, Patrali. Passer, once again, a big thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to interact with the students. It was lovely interacting with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Parth,
Okay.
sir, for precious time. And on behalf of the society, I would like to thank you for enriching us with your knowledge. And I guess with that, we would like to conclude this today's session on constitutional concepts. So we'll meet again tomorrow with a new topic on union and citizenship, which will be held by Professor Vishal Sharma. And so I guess that's it. Thank you, Ashutosh sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all the
Thanks.
participants for participating.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patrali. Okay, thank you,
Thank
everyone. See you tomorrow.